David, your collection of things that you use in your work is incredible. Why are you collect Southern black memorabilia? Now, why is that?
Well, actually, the Blackface series, as well as pretty much all of the work that I've done since I started working with toys, which was in 1972, the series have always and often evolved by happenstance. The Blackface series really began when I was trying to put together figures for a kind of recreation of Birth of a Nation, the D.W. Griffith film. And in doing my sort of collecting for that, I came across the black memorabilia, which I'd always had a certain passing familiarity with, you know, the Aunt Jemima cookie jars and the salt and pepper shakers. But I happened to be at a very large antique show in Atlantic City, and it was the first time that I really began to see the depth and the sort of breadth of material. And the first time I took some of the objects into the Polaroid studio, which is where I do most of my work on the 20 by 24 Polaroid camera, the images were so powerful that I decided that, you know, the idea of redoing the Birth of a Nation really lost its interest to me, and I really focused on the black memorabilia, and I started doing more research. I think, quite frankly, coming from a liberal arts background, I went to Stanford as an undergraduate. You know, my first inclination whenever I'm beginning a series is to find some books and do some reading. And, you know, I found some wonderful material on black memorabilia, and I just became fascinated, as I said, by how much material there was, the just historical range. I mean, I have some objects from, you know, the late 1800s, and I have some figures from 1990. So to me, it became a sort of reference for American social history. And a lot of the objects are European because of their long colonial past. A lot of objects are Japanese. So there's a real sort of cultural history in the objects, not just of America, but of, you know, Europe and the Far East as well. And my collections really sort of come from the work. I'm not, you know, although my sister once said that I'm really a toy collector and art is my hobby, all the figures that I've collected from the various series are really in reference to work that I'm doing. But I may very well collect figures for a considerable amount of time before I actually begin the work. With the Blackface series, I was really beginning the work and beginning collecting pretty much simultaneously, and I ended up going to a couple of shows in the Washington, D.C. area specifically of black memorabilia, which were quite interesting in and of themselves because most of the dealers, I would say 75%, as well as an equal number of the visitors to the show, were African American.
When you make these photographs, what is it that you are saying about these collections, about this part of the cultural history of the United States?
I think it really, you know, it varies. One of my earliest series with the 20 by 24 Polaroid camera was of cowboy and Indian figures. And for me, it was really a way to go back and re-examine my childhood. You know, I grew up in the 50s at a time when I sort of call it the first television generation. And, many, if not most, of the programs on television were Westerns. I think I read in one of the books when I was doing some research that 60% of the television programs were Westerns during a period in the 50s. If you looked at an old Sears toy catalog, there were page after page of toy cap guns and Western outfits for kids. So there was a lot for me personally of sort of re-examining that and the way it created this sort of faux history. It was about a West, as I said once in a lecture, a West that never existed but always will be. And when you look at those programs, when you have some distance on them, they were very sort of socializing and moralistic. The bad guys always were brought to justice somehow, and you were kind of inculcated with the idea of sacrificing your individuality for the good of the town or the wagon train, and that sort of ideology was one that was really promoted by those early programs. That sort of John Wayne heroic attitude and the attitude of sacrifice, which had nothing to do with the reality of either the history of the American West or of combat. So I think what I was trying to do with the Western work was to look back on it with a certain sense of nostalgia, but also a certain critique. And what was interesting to me about that work is when I was able to do a traveling show, which originated at the Gene Autry Museum back in I guess it was in the mid-90s, the response at an institution like the Autry was very different than, say, the response to showing that work in New York. And I've always said about my work that it's intentionally ambiguous, that it's meant to draw the viewer in and really reflect upon the viewer's own feelings and sort of remembered imagery, so that somebody might look at it as very nostalgic, but somebody else might look at it as a critique of the American West as portrayed by John Ford and Frederick Remington. And yet it's the same piece of artwork. It's almost as if the artwork serves as a kind of Rorschach test, more for the viewer than for myself.
David, what about the response abroad? Because the work, this body of work, both the blackface and also the cowboy and Indian, is so typically American. Mm-hmm. How were they received abroad?
I think the cowboy work has always been very well received. The blackface work is work that I've always felt, if I had the opportunity to sort of show it on a larger scale rather than just a few images, would be, showing it in Europe would be very intriguing to me because of the history of colonial Africa that is so strong in countries like Belgium, France, England. And I hope that someday, I'll have that opportunity to put together a larger exhibition of the work rather than just a handful of images. At present, the blackface work has been shown primarily in this country, and I'd have to say one of the best receptions for the work that I ever had was in Alexandria, Virginia, at a local Black History Museum. And the museum is in what I believe is the first Black public library in the United States. And the audience there was terrific. I mean, it was a very sort of wide range of people from the African American community primarily, and both the younger people and the older people were extremely receptive to the work and very, very positive about it.
I was curious to see the connection between the white dolls that were also sexually depicted, along with the black memorabilia, the women depicted.
Well, there's always, an exaggeration of the female form, and I think that sort of is true in so many aspects of our culture and our society that, the XXX series, which is the series that I did with these plastic model kits of what are essentially exotic dancers. And even an earlier series called American Beauties, which was these small plastic figures from the 50s that had that sort of post-war sensuality and sexuality, the kind of Marilyn Monroe, Betty Grable figures, really captured that period's imagery of sexuality for women. There's always been that kind of exaggeration in figures dealing with women, I think, regardless of sort of the style or the period of the piece.
David, which came first, your photography or your collecting?
Well, I think it was really the photography. I started working with toys when I was in graduate school, and I started working with these very small, what are called HO scale toy soldiers, just little plastic figures, 50 to a box. One thing that was actually quite fascinating to me is several years ago when my grandmother passed away, we were going through all the things in her apartment here in New York, and my sister came across these photographs of me from Christmas in 1954. So I was about 4.5 years old, and I'd gotten a set of these beautifully hand-painted, German-made cowboy and Indian figures. And as my sister pointed out, I was looking quite serious, but these were figures that I ended up photographing, 30 years later. Not all of the ones that I originally had survived because in addition to my sister, I had 2 younger brothers, so there was, most of the toys were damaged, but I did manage to save a few, and I was able to find some of these earlier toys, and then the company started making them in plastic. They had been made in something called composition, which was like a sort of a paste made of wood pulp products with a wire armature and then hand painted. I mean, they're quite beautiful and very stylized in the sense of, say, 40s Hollywood, with the rounded hats and the polka dot scarves for the cowboys. And those were the figures that I used for the Wild West series. So there was some collecting involved, and I'm sure, as a child, because I did buy little metal toy soldiers and play with them often on my floor, that I think all of that, kind of came to the surface when I started using toys, particularly toy soldiers, as my subject matter.
When did the tableau idea come?
The tableau ideas really came in graduate school. I mean, I went to graduate school having sort of worked through my Ansel Adams and Edward Weston period, and I was doing more sort of a Lee Friedlander type of, social documentary photography. The tableaus really started my second year in graduate school when I wanted to do some work in a studio environment. And just, again, totally by chance, was walking through a department store in New Haven in the toy department, and I saw these play sets. And it reminded me a little bit of, my childhood, and I thought, well, I'll take one of these play sets, set it up in the studio, and use this work for my thesis project. And it was really an outgrowth of that led me to the toy soldiers, and it was the toy soldiers that really generated the momentum. I went home over the Christmas break and just shot hundreds and hundreds of photographs on the floor of my old bedroom, and became extremely enthusiastic because this was something really new and different. And when I came back in January for portfolio review, I was going to Yale, and Walker Evans was teaching there at the time. And so most of the work people were doing was a very sort of refined and careful presentation, large format photography, over-matted prints, very elegant presentation. My presentation consisted of about 400 Codolith prints, and putting them in front of various people and saying, I'm really excited about this new work. And fortuitously, Linda Connor was the visiting artist for a week in from the San Francisco Art Institute. And Linda really shared and encouraged my enthusiasm. And that was sort of the momentum that I needed to really, continue pursuing that for the rest of the year. And, there was just a lot of sort of youthful enthusiasm. And then shortly after graduation, one of my classmates, Gary Trudeau, was approached by his publisher, who said, why don't you and David combine your work to do a book project? And that was really the genesis of the Hitler Moves East book, which came out in 1977. Gary was a graphic design graduate student at Yale. We were in the same program because photography was sort of a sub-department of design. And for his thesis project, he did a visual biography of a German Luftwaffe pilot using just graphic symbols. He essentially created a character and this whole sort of history using graphics. And I was doing the toy soldiers, and many of the toy soldiers, if not most of the ones I was photographing, were little German, World War II figures. And I had read a book by a German author called Hitler Moves East. That was the translation from the German. The author's name was Paul Carell, and it was a very similar to Cornelius Ryan's book, The Longest Day, which is essentially weaving together first-person accounts in a sort of dramatic fashion, so the book really almost reads like a novel. And when Gary's publisher, Jim Andrews, saw Gary's work and some of my photographs, because we had traded some work as graduate students are want to do, he was the one who said, you two guys should do a book together. And this was back in, I guess, either late 73 or early 74, and we were both like 24 years old, and we thought, well, that sounds like a cool idea, and I think when we signed, I remember when we got our advance checks, which were all of about $750 a piece, Gary handed me my check and he said, now remember, if you cash this check, we really do have to make this book. And we actually, we thought we'd be finished in a year. It took us about 3.5 years. But it really allowed Gary to, use both his design skills and his editorial skills, because I was doing the photographs and he was really sort of working them together into this kind of coherent structure. And my work evolved a lot over the 3.5 years. You know, I started out initially doing these very sort of raw tableaus just on a floor, and then I kept adding more and more sort of background material. And actually, most of the images in the book were probably shot during about a 9-month period. But it took me over 2 years to sort of develop the work stylistically. And once that happened, the work came very, very quickly. So, you know, it was a real sort of evolutionary process for me. But, you know, it was a great collaboration, and, you know, Gary and I are, you know, still friends to this day. So it's been now, you know, over 30 years.
How influenced were you by film?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. I would say film, more than any other art form, has been the most pervasive influence on my work. The modern romance series, which drew very heavily upon sort of Edward Hopper paintings, drew equally from film noir. And in fact, I sort of was introduced to film noir at an exhibition at the San Francisco Museum, where they ran a film series based on films whose imagery was drawn from Hopper's paintings. It was part of a large Hopper retrospective, I think back in the early 80s. But film's always been sort of a source that I've turned to, whether it was for, you know, the toy soldiers, looking at both documentary and fictional war films. It's, you know, it's something that I've always gravitated to, as I said, more than I think any other art form, as a kind of a reference.
David, thank you very much for letting us come.
Oh, well, thank you.
It was a joy. Thank you.
And a delight.
Thank
you,
you.
David.
Which is where I do most of my work on the 20 by 24 Polaroid camera. The images were so powerful that I decided that, you know, the idea of redoing The Birth of a Nation really lost its interest to me, and I really focused on the black memorabilia, and I started doing more research. I think, quite frankly, coming from a liberal arts background, I went to Stanford as an undergraduate. You know, my first inclination whenever I'm beginning a series is to find some books and do some reading. And, you know, I found some wonderful material on black memorabilia, and I just became fascinated, as I said, by how much material there was, the just historical range. I mean, I have some objects from, you know, the late 1800s, and I have some figures from 1990. So to me, it became a sort of reference for American social history. And a lot of the objects are European because of their long colonial past. A lot of objects are Japanese. So there's a real sort of cultural history in the objects, not just of America, but of, you know, Europe and the Far East as well. And my collections really sort of come from the work. I'm not, you know, although my sister once said that I'm really a toy collector and art is my hobby, all the figures that I've collected from the various series are really in reference to work that I'm doing. But I may very well collect figures for a considerable amount of time before I actually begin the work. With the Blackface series, I was really beginning the work and beginning collecting pretty.
David, your collection of things that you use in your work is incredible. Why are you collect Southern black memorabilia? Now, why is that?
Well, actually, the Blackface series, as well as pretty much all the work that I've done since I started working with toys, which was in 1972, the series have always and often evolved by happenstance. The Blackface series really began when I was trying to put together figures for a kind of recreation of Birth of a Nation, the D.W. Griffith film. And in doing my sort of collecting for that, I came across the black memorabilia, which I'd always had a certain passing familiarity with, you know, the Aunt Jemima cookie jars and the salt and pepper shakers. But I happened to be at a very large antique show in Atlantic City, and it was the first time that I really began to see the depth and the sort of breadth of material. And the first time I took some of the objects into the Polaroid studio,